Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming out today. Can you hear me? Yes. I attempted to be cute too, but I followed Deirdre's example and realized I should turn it on before I came to the stage. She looks much cuter. There's like these heels happening, and I'm a flat girl kind of, flat shoe kind of girl. Anyway, so this afternoon in the next 15 or 20 minutes, I want to share with you this proposition of actually this notion of cloth as a monument. And some of the stories I have to share with you today are going to be very personal. I'm an artist, so it starts from me. It's going to be all about me for a little bit. But it starts from me in this notion that the personal becomes universal, right? The most personal can become universal. So some of the stories I'm going to share with you are personal to my family tree. Some of them are collective. Some of them might connect us in unexpected and surprising ways. And I'm hoping that we'll stitch between places as far as from West Africa, I'm going to start there, to Jamaica, to Scotland, Detroit, Richmond, and Appomattox. But to begin, let's start here in Louisville by way of Washington, D.C. So this is my first time to Louisville, and I too am from Washington, D.C., born and raised. My parents, who were Caribbean immigrants, so I like to say I'm from the deep, deep South, right? Deep, deep South. When they migrated to D.C., they did their best to get us the best education they could manage. And that meant that I ended up attending the Citadel Friends School in Washington, D.C., and if that sounds even vaguely familiar to you, it's because the Obama girls went there and Chelsea Clinton went there, but I'm the one who made the school famous. But it was there in Washington, D.C. that I met my best friend, Leah Gilliam. That might not be a name that you know. Leah is the third daughter of Sam Gilliam, so I'm hoping that's a name that's familiar to you, Louisville people, because he is, in my opinion, and many others, Louisville's most famous painter. So I'm in graduate school at Cranbrook Academy of Art, and I go home to speak to my best friend's dad, who's this amazing painter, to interview him for my thesis. And he said, others look to a monument, we look to a piece of cloth. And so it is that I'm here in Mr. Gilliam's hometown for the first time talking to you about the monumentality of cloth. So let's begin our journey, and I'm going to begin way back there in West Africa. So this idea of collective cloth, if you're familiar with this image, bear with me. If you're not, we're going to move through it quickly. In West Africa, among the Yoruba people in Nigeria and now Benin as well, cloth is a monument. And here is an egungun that is celebrating the monumentality of cloth, the collective, it's sort of a collective envisioning of one's DNA. The egungun is made out of strips. This particular one is made out of strips of cloth. Sometimes the egunguns are made out of these wide circles of cloth. The dance, the masquerade, the monumentality depends on this circular movement of the dancer. And when the cloth goes out like this and wisps by the ears of those who are gathered there, it is said that your ancestors are whispering to you. This is why I want to be a textile artist, right? It's that kind of way of thinking about cloth and monumentality. Now, clearly, some Yoruba people who were forcibly migrated through the transatlantic slave trade to Jamaica, where my mother is from, and my grandmother, and that whole side of my family. Because we find Pitchy Patchy in Jamaica, which is the attempt of those enslaved Africans from West Africa who did not become fish food and whose souls did not go to the heavens, but actually made it across the deplorable conditions. And when they landed in Jamaica, one of the things that they wanted to do was celebrate, through the monumentality of cloth, their ancestral ties. This is why I'm a textile artist. Anybody here been to Jamaica before? There are always a few. Great. Any actual Jamaicans? There used to be a time I would ask that question, there was always a Jamaican in the crowd, so something's happening to figure out what's going on there. Anyway, so Jamaica's motto is out of many, one people, and that applies deeply to my own family as well. My mother's maiden name is McCarty, and it's a family name, not a slave name. And my great-grandfather was from the Highlands of Scotland. He married my great-grandmother, so this white man from the Highlands of Scotland married this black woman from we don't quite know where. She was said to be a Moor, right? Her name was Jane White, his name Alexander McCarty. The Highlands of Scotland, where the McCartys were from, there is a tradition of Clootie Wells, where one would walk with their tartan, their family cloth, to find a naturally occurring spring or well, and you would take a pilgrimage to these wells so that you could heal your addled mind, comfort your broken heart, wash your arthritic hands. You would tear a piece of your tartan, dip it into this naturally occurring spring, wash that part of your body, and then tie the cloth to the nearest tree. So the tree then becomes a monument, monumental cloth. So in the we need one more image up there, yes. So in the 1990s, late 80s, early 90s, when I was in graduate school, undergraduate and graduate school, the Art Institute of Chicago and then at Cranbrook, Kente Cloth, which is what you see on the right here, is what you saw everywhere as this symbol of Africanity, of the African diaspora, King's Cloth from the Ghanaian group, from the Ashanti in Ghana. So that cloth was being used as a way to talk about Africanness. And I also knew this cloth. This is a Scottish tartan, but not just any Scottish tartan. This actually happens to be the McCarty Scottish tartan. So that's something I knew for many years of my life. I knew this cloth before I knew this cloth. So fast forward to graduate school, and I'm just outside of Detroit. And I go to these women who have become my sisters, my aunties, my mothers. Right? There's the community in Detroit who have taken me in. They tried to save me from the white ivory tower that is Cranbrook, and they would feed me and take care of me. And they allowed me to make their heads into monuments of cloth. My way of trying to bring together both the American flag as a monumental cloth and also Kente cloth as a monumental cloth to talk about the identity of African Americanness and to tie their heads and tell me what they knew about these two monumental cloths, how they felt about the American flag, how they felt about Kente cloth. Now, I myself was studying Kente cloth both with a fabulous professor that I had at Amherst College, the same who introduced me to the Egungun, Roland Abiodun, and also at the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art. And I studied how this cloth could speak. Literally, there are proverbs woven into the cloth. The three that you see in this inset here that don't look like the American flag have proverbs tied to them and long histories. This is the first piece I ever made. It's from 1995 that I made using a flag of any sort. 50 women tied their heads in the cloth. This piece is imbued with their knowledge and their presence, and I like to think that it absorbed the stories that we had in a transactional kind of way. So it becomes a monument. But back to Jamaica, out of many one people. That same McCarty tartan that I showed you earlier, you can see a little inset of it here on the bottom left-hand side of the screen. And that is made out of Scottish wool, of course. The long piece of cloth that you see, which is 15 feet, so imagine this 5 times, it would extend to the end of that stage, is a cloth that I wove using the McCarty tartan as a pattern, but it's made out of bagasse. Now bagasse is the leftover fiber, when you squeeze out all the good stuff out of sugar cane, which is what you're seeing here. What's left over, the throwaway stuff, is bagasse. Now, some very enterprising green designers have turned that material into a fiber that then I dyed and wove in my studio into the McCarty tartan. So again, this complexity of a cloth, a monumental cloth that has these two sorts of sides. First that you saw, bringing two images together, and this bringing materiality and image together. Now, when I made this cloth, the intent for it was for it to go, I love to travel. So I said, if I make this cloth and I go to all the places that my very diasporic family lives, then I get to travel a lot. Here's where my family lives. The United States of America, Jamaica, and this is the McCarty side of the family, Jamaica, Ghana, and Scotland. The transatlantic slave trade routes is where my family still lives. So I thought I could take this cloth with me, go visit my elders, wrap them in this cloth, and take these very formal portraits of them one by one. What ended up happening was nothing of the sort. 2 years ago, in 2015, one of my aunties died in Jamaica, and I took this cloth, which it's 15 feet of cloth and about a yard wide. It's a lot of cloth, and I travel pretty light. So I stuffed it in my suitcase, and I said, I'm going to bring it to this funeral. I'm going to insert art in this funeral. It might be the wrong thing to do, but let me just try it anyway. What ended up happening is that my family, as soon as I took this cloth out, there's not a single portrait, by the way, not a single formal portrait. They descended on this cloth in this way. Nobody wanted to be in the cloth alone. Everybody wanted to be in the cloth together. They understood that it was the McCarty tartan. They also understood when I told them that it was made out of bagasse, that it was our cloth in a uniquely Jamaican, deep, deep Southern way. Now, here's the thing. I did move to the Deep South 12 years ago. And by that, I mean Richmond, Virginia, which is where I've lived for a dozen years. And in those dozen years, I served as the chair of the Craft and Material Studies Department at Virginia Commonwealth University, though I since have stepped down because 12 years, really, come on. As chair, ugh. In 2010, Governor Bob McDonald, the then Governor Bob McDonald of Virginia, proclaimed April Confederate History Month. Now, here's the thing about that. This might surprise you, but I actually didn't have a problem with him proclaiming April as Confederate History Month. What I had a problem with is that this man seemed not to know that 80% of this country's GDP in 1860 was on the backs of the contributions that enslaved people had given to this nation. Well, I mean, where were we in this story? So I put us in the story. I painted this flag on a canvas. The Confederate battle flag, and then I stitched through that flag with cotton thread, black cotton thread, and then I used this idea of synecdoche. See, I used our $1 million word. Using the hairstyling techniques to stand in for the African American presence, to make the stripes in cornrows to talk about the labor, and the Bantu knots for the stars to talk about the people and the culture and the language. To put the history back in where the history was missing. And there's more to the American story than this. Of course there's more, but this was notably absent. So this piece belongs to the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. And it became part of their collection just around the time that the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts on their grounds had elected to take down the Confederate battle flag that was hanging on their grounds. And so the flaggers came out. People said, you've removed our flag from these Confederate grounds. And I like to say to them, there's a Confederate flag now in the museum. But I did have a gentleman who was the president of, the director of the Confederate History Museum in Richmond, Virginia, who shot me a very nice email and invited me to the Confederate History Museum because he wanted to teach me a thing or two. And one of the things that he wanted to teach me is that in shorthand, I would often refer to this flag as a Confederate flag, when in fact it is the Confederate battle flag, or the battle flag of the Confederacy. Because the Confederate flag is a square, not a rectangle. And he wanted to share this with me, just to give me a little bit of education. I said, okay, all right. I said, I know this, but I couldn't have made this piece if it was square. You couldn't fit the American flag on it. And he went, oh, yeah, okay. While I was there in the museum, he showed me one of the original Confederate battle flags that has this design. There were several Confederate flags before they landed on this one. And then, of course, it got popularized with the rise of the KKK. These are things that I do not need to tell this audience, but nonetheless. When I attempted to take a picture of the original Confederate flag, it's behind glass, it's silk, it's threadbare, it's in a dimly lit room. I'm trying to take this picture, and as I take the picture, I realize that the glass becomes a mirror, and my face, can you see, this is the same forehead right here, right? So I see myself reflected in the threadbare parts of this flag. Fast forward to April, or 2015. We're celebrating in Richmond the 150th anniversary of the end of the Civil War. And I decided that it was time because, as we know, this was a time in our history, it wasn't so long ago, but it was a time in our history that our nation was really paying attention to the fact that something was in the news that was not at all new. And what was in the news that was not at all new is that African American people were getting shot in the street by people who decided that they needed to police these criminals who we freed in that 13th Amendment and that lovely little clause at the end, you know. Black people were getting shot in the streets. And this was news, but it wasn't new because the criminalization of African American bodies has been something that has been part of this nation for a very, very long time. So I took one of those pieced cotton Confederate flags, a brand new one, and I took it down to its threads and segregated them with my studio assistants. And it took us months to do this, to take it apart thread by thread. But that wasn't enough, because this is sort of the end game, you know? And I realized that one of the things that needed to happen was the conversations. And so in an exhibition that was proposed by a colleague of mine, Lauren Ross, called New Dominion, that was held in Chelsea, New York, I decided to perform Unraveling, to invite people, as we have tomorrow here at the Speed Art Museum. So I invite all of you to join us. We'll see how many people can get through. To help me undo the Confederate flag thread by thread, as a way to really thinking about this whole conversation that we're having in these next couple of days. Like, what does it mean? What does monumentality mean? How does something become a monument? How do we then challenge, think about the historization of that monument? How do we deal with history in the present? What is the dialogue that happens quietly, shoulder to shoulder, among two people? How does racism exist in small ways and large ways? What are the most important acts? Is it small acts, big acts, everything in between? Those are the kinds of conversations I have with people as we are unthreading, unraveling this Confederate battle flag. And so the last piece that I want to end on is that I bet if I asked any of you right now, before we even showed you this image, if I asked you to draw a Confederate flag, you could all draw one. More or less, it doesn't matter. You don't have to have a lot of art skills. You could basically draw one. Is that true? Yeah, you guys, right? This is a tricky crowd for this next question. I almost feel like calling out some people and saying, you don't get to answer, but I'll just do it anyway. How How many of you know what this is? Not Lisa. Oh, okay, this is good. So I only had to call out one person, Lisa Fryman, haha. This is a piece of cloth that ended the Civil War. This is a piece of cloth. This is the monument that brought this nation together. This is the Confederate flag of truce that was used by Lee at Appomattox. Y'all didn't know that, right? But the flag that separated the nation, you could draw it. And it's not that this is indistinct. It's got these three little stripes on either side. This is it's at the Smithsonian National Museum of American Art, which is where I researched it. It has been divided in half. So the cloth that brought our nation together was divided in half. Half lives in the Smithsonian. The other half has been divided into lots and lots of little different pieces, like a relic all over the South and in private collections. So I want to burn this on your retina so that you can draw this and so that we can bring this nation back together, because we have a lot of work to do, y'all. We have a lot more work to do now than ever before. This is my attempt at making a faithful reproduction of the Confederate flag of truce. The Confederate flag of truce, if I didn't mention earlier, was a dishcloth that was woven in linen in Richmond, Virginia, and got repurposed as a monument to end the Civil War. And I've stitched it together with suture threads. This country is deeply wounded. It requires serious healers and skilled surgeons, and I hope that we can do that work together. Thank you.